I hate when watch writers and watch YouTubers are like, at 15 millimeters, it slides nicely under the cuff. A cuff of what? A wizard's sleeve? When it comes to choosing a watch to buy, size matters. Watches come in a range of shapes and sizes, wrists come in a range of shapes and sizes, and despite what the internet says, there is no such thing as the perfect size for a watch. We have a whole lot of watches in the studio with us today, and we're gonna go from largest to smallest, pointing out different factors along the way that make them feel different than what the measurements may indicate. For reference, my wrist is 6.5 inches in circumference, or about 16.5 centimeters. That's on the small to medium size for men, so if you're like me and you often worry if a watch is gonna be too big for your wrist, this video will be especially helpful. The simple fact is, if a watch doesn't fit you, you're not gonna end up wearing it. There is more flexibility here than there is with shoe sizing, but there are limitations as well. We're gonna start strapping watches on in a second, and I want you to keep one brilliant analogy in mind as we do. I believe it was Mark Cho, founder of The Armory and creator of a very comprehensive watch sizing study, who advises people to think of choosing a watch like choosing a painting for your home. Your wrist is the wall and the watch is the artwork. You can fill up the entire wall with a big painting, or you can hang a smaller painting and leave more negative space around it. The only thing you can't do is choose a painting that's larger than the wall itself, meaning don't buy a watch if the lugs extend beyond your wrist bones. We're starting off today with a Seiko 5 diver. This is where a lot of watch collections begin, and Seiko divers are watches that collectors keep coming back to even after they've been in the hobby for years. It's a larger case at 42.5 millimeters in diameter, but with a relatively short lug to lug of only 46 millimeters. To me, lug to lug is a higher priority than simply the diameter. That's because you have more room to work with east to west than you do north to south. The Seiko 5 is a thicker watch at 13.4 millimeters, and the NATO strap only adds to that. It's also quite evenly thick across the top compared to some more sloped cases that we'll talk about in a minute. This is not a watch that will slide easily underneath a cuff, but it is a great option for short sleeves in summer. Speaking of fitness, you need to consider your entire body, not just your wrist, when choosing a watch. A big watch will make the rest of you look smaller in comparison. That's why cruise ships choose small furniture to make the cabin rooms seem larger than they actually are. And if you have a thinner wrist top to bottom and a thinner frame, a chunky hunk of steel will not be the way to go. Let's quickly hit this handsome Omega Seamaster Aqua Terra. It's a 41.5 millimeter watch with pretty standard proportions. The lack of a diving bezel here makes the dial feel more expansive, and the polished case only adds to that. Thankfully, black is slimming for clothes and for watches, so the dark dial keeps the watch from feeling too overwhelming. For a dial that is not dark and subdued, let's try on this 41 millimeter Rolex Oyster Perpetual. God, I love this watch. This OP is only 0.5 millimeters smaller in diameter than the Omega Aqua Terra, but it is much more visible from across the room. For a wrist in my size, I think the 41 is a little too large, but thankfully Rolex does offer a fairly wide range of sizes that we'll see more in a sec. Next up is a grail watch for many folks, and for good reason. It's the Rolex GMT-Master II with a diameter of 40 millimeters, a lug to lug of 48, and a thickness of about 12. This is a sweet spot size for many people, and if you want a 40 millimeter watch that fits like a 40 millimeter watch, this is the gold standard. One note, around 2005, Rolex switched over to the Maxi case that you see here. This, as the name implies, is a more robust case thickness than previous versions. There's also not a lot of arc from the lug to lug, so you do feel all 48 millimeters of that distance. Let's move on to the Zenith Chronomaster Revival Shadow. It's got a titanium case and a strap, which makes the watch noticeably light on the wrist. The murdered out all black finish also keeps the watch looking visually compact when compared to the steel variation of this watch. The diameter is only 37 millimeters, which is certainly on the smaller side for a chronograph, and the thickness comes in just under 13 millimeters, which is also very rare for chronographs, especially automatic ones like this that house the famous El Primero movement. This watch is incredibly comfortable to wear, and a lot of it comes down to the lug-to-lug curvature that I mentioned earlier. Whereas the side profile of the Rolex Oyster case is more straight across, the Zenith has these nicely curved lugs that wrap around the wrist in a very organic way. One quick note though, if you have a larger, beefier wrist, you may have issues with the downward pointing lugs digging into your skin a little bit. Next up is one of the most popular daily drivers on the market. It's the Rolex Explorer. The one we have here is the classic 36mm case size, although Rolex also makes a 40mm version, and you can easily find the old 39mm case size as well. The dimensions for this watch are quite similar to the Datejust, which is another watch that also comes in multiple sizes. The watch looks good on pretty much any wrist, and the lug width of 20mm adds more wrist presence than you might expect for a 36mm watch. The thickness is only about 12mm, and the polished bezel is nicely sloped for an easy fit underneath the cuff, so this can work well in sporty and dressy environments alike. After all, why spend hundreds or even thousands of dollars on a carefully tailored suit if your watch isn't carefully tailored as well? One quick tip here that applies to pretty much any watch on this list: if you want to see it on a variety of different wrist sizes, just type the model name or reference number into the search bar on Instagram, and you'll have a whole world of visual examples to compare. We'll jump quickly to another 36mm watch, and it's the Baltic MR01, a micro brand release that sold out almost immediately. Let's compare the Explorer to this watch to reiterate how dial color can make a watch look smaller or larger. The silver dial reflects more light and therefore feels larger than it is. The polished flat bezel only adds to that, and the monotone treatment of the Baltic here makes the eye take in the watch as a whole instead of piece by piece. That last point is especially true for integrated bracelet watches like the Tissot PRX, for example. Warning, we are now going below 36mm.
Warning. Warning. Ew, gross.
If this is scary territory for you, please turn your eyes away from the screen. We're using this 1940s LeCoultre Powermatic to show why lug-to-lug distance should be considered more important than sheer diameter. This is a vintage watch, about 80 years old in fact, and this and other vintage watches are almost always smaller than what is considered standard sizing today. This watch is only 33mm wide, but it fits closer to a 35 or 36, and that's because the lug-to-lug is long and elegant at 44mm. The same as the Explorer that we saw earlier. This same principle applies to watches like the Universal Jeanette Pole Router, a vintage classic that also has disproportionately long lugs. We'll keep it in the family with this JLC Reverso, the go-to dress watch for many. The key point to notice here is how rectangular watches fit versus their circular counterpart. With these, you'll see lots of articles about how the measurements on paper are one thing, but the watch feels like a totally different thing. With the Reverso, for example, it's quite skinny from side to side, but quite expansive from top to bottom, thus creating a long line across the wrist. On paper, it's only about 25.5mm wide, but about 43mm lug to lug. So people with larger wrists can and do wear this watch with ease. It's also a dress watch, so it's supposed to be smaller in size. And the nice thing about smaller watches in general is that they show off more of the bracelet or strap. We'll end it on the smallest end of the spectrum with some dress watches from upstart young brands like Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Vacheron Constantin. These are all small and thin with cases that are comparable in size to a Cartier tank, in case that's on your list as well. You can wear these as a daily if you want to, although most save them for special occasions. I find that ultra-thin watches like this avoid a lot of scratches by hugging to the wrist so closely and by hiding underneath the cuff for most of the day. Again, dress watches, especially from heritage brands like these, are meant to be smaller and more elegant wearing. Old Hollywood stars have worn watches like these, and you'll look great in one as well. Thank you all for making it this far. We went all the way from 42.5 all the way down to about 25mm. Size does matter, but you do have a little more flexibility here than you do with shoe sizing. Think of it like hanging a painting on a wall in your home, and when in doubt, go a little bit smaller versus going a little bit larger. You'll get used to it anyways within a week. I'm Thomas Hendricks with Chrono24 in New York. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this, and if I missed anything, please drop a comment below to help out your fellow watch lovers. That's a wrap here in New York. We'll see you next time, and until then, enjoy your watches.